When it comes to growing tomatoes, knowing the difference between indeterminate and determinate varieties will help you grow healthier plants and ultimately produce more tomatoes in the long run. So by the end of this video, you'll learn how to identify, how to prune, and how to trellis both indeterminate and determinate tomato varieties. Let's go! Hey, and welcome back to Mini Urban Farm, a channel about gardening and homesteading in the suburbs. Today I am trellising and pruning my tomato plants, both my determinate and my indeterminate varieties. For my determinate, I have my Roma tomatoes, which I grow every year, and then for my indeterminate, I have my grape tomatoes, which I also grow every year, and I'm growing orange peach tomatoes, which are an indeterminate variety of tomatoes. I have never grown these, but I'm excited to see what they taste like, how they grow, all of that good stuff. So how do you find out if your tomatoes that you're growing in your garden are determinate or indeterminate varieties, or the seeds that you're planning on starting are determinate or indeterminate? Well, there's a few places you could look. Number one, you could just Google it. You can type in grape tomatoes, determinate or indeterminate, and it should pop up that grape tomatoes are an indeterminate variety. So you can just search for the variety of tomato that you're planning on growing plus determinate/indeterminate, and it should show up whatever variety of tomato you are growing. Now, why is that important? Well, when I first started growing tomatoes several years ago, I had no idea what indeterminate versus determinate meant, and ultimately my plants weren't doing as well as they could have done if I would have known the difference. So a determinate variety is a tomato that gets between 2 and 4 feet. It gets a little bit more bushy, right? You use a different trellis type because it doesn't really grow on a regular trellis. And it only produces a set number of flowers and a set number of tomatoes. So it's more of an annual, right? It's not gonna grow out over multiple seasons. You just get your tomatoes, and once it stops producing fruit, that's it. You rip it up and you plant out a new tomato plant at the end of the season or the beginning of the season. Now, an indeterminate variety of tomato is one that has more of a vining tendency. So, for example, my grape tomatoes here, which you can tell I have my trellis behind me. The trellis goes all the way up, across, and down in front of me in like a little rectangular area on top of the raised bed. Now, this tomato variety will just continue to produce flowers over and over and over, and I will get fruit as long as I am producing a healthy environment for those tomato plants. I will have tomatoes. So every gardener has their preference, of course. My preference is to grow indeterminate tomato varieties just because in my garden it takes up less space, right? They don't have to grow in a bush. They can grow on a vertical trellis and I can plant things underneath. So it just, for my preference, would be indeterminate tomatoes, but I do still grow determinate tomatoes because a lot of these sauce tomatoes like Romas, they are determinate tomatoes, and I still want all of my sauce tomatoes so that I can make sauce at the end of the season. Alright, so we're going to start with our indeterminate tomatoes. These are grape tomatoes, and there are 4 tomato plants in this side of the raised bed. There is one over here, another one here, this big one is one, and then that one over here is another one. I also have 4 more on that side, and they will grow up this trellis, across all the way, and then the next ones will grow up that side, across, and they will kind of meet in the middle. So you can see that we already have little baby tomato flowers, which is the perfect time to prune and trellis. So let's start with the pruning because it's the easy part. You might need a pair of scissors if you have like really thick branches, but for the most part you will be able to just do this with your fingers, and I do have a pair of scissors over here just in case. So I have my shears. Alright, so let's start right here at the bottom. I am going to be taking out all of these lower leaves, anything that has the ability to touch the floor or is close enough to the floor where pests or flies or anything that is on the dirt, or where anything that is on the dirt can jump up and create some sort of pest issue. You can see that there is a little bit of damage here already from some leaf miners and pests, and you don't really see that on the top leaves at all. It's pretty much on the ones closer to the floor. So we're going to prune off everything. Now, I know that that is sometimes tough because like this big giant branch here, this is coming out this way and it already has little flower buds on it. So it kind of sucks to be pruning that off because it is going to produce tomatoes, but ultimately you want a plant that is healthier instead of just riddled with fruit with problems. So I'm going to see if I can do this with only one hand. I'm going to come in here and just snip off everything at the bottom. Alright, so you can see I removed a whole bunch already, and the plant looks way thinner. Oops, I forgot 1 or 2 over here. There we go. All right, so you can see you have way more of a bare rootstock. Now, as the plant grows and produces more up here at the top, then I will come back and, you know, as needed, just continue getting this stem a little bit more bare. Ultimately, when my plants are fully grown, they come to about here or so without any leaves. I'm gonna leave these ones on for right now just so that they can, you know, continue to grow. But what this does ultimately is it prevents pest and disease from getting from the soil into your lower levels of your plants and then raising up to the rest of the plant. And also when you have little baby tomato flowers like these ones that are just popping up this morning, it allows the plant to focus more on producing flowers and fruits instead of trying to ward off whatever disease or pest are at the bottom levels of plants. So I'm going to go ahead and do that to all of them, and then you'll see it's much cleaner in here. Alright, and you can already tell the difference between these plants over here with the stems way bare on the bottom part, and these ones over here that are much more bushy. I'm going to go ahead and do that to all of the plants that are in this box. Another thing that you want to do is you want to pick off any suckers, right? And they're called suckers. I'm not exactly sure why they're called that, but you have the main stem and then you have a branch. And then if I can get closer up in here, this little thing right here, this is a sucker, right? So you want to go ahead and just kind of pinch these off, and they come out pretty easily when they're small. If they're larger, then you can use scissors. And you can do this at any point on the plant. So as you can see, we did it in the lower leaves, but you can also do it on the upper leaves when the plant is much taller. You can see here's one, right? You want to get in here, and it's always going to look like this little V shape, all right, with this extra little bud coming out. Now, when the plant is starting out, mostly is when I do this. When the plant gets bigger, I'm not as diligent about doing this, mostly because I like when it's, you can tell Milo's crying over there. He wants to be played with. Let me just close the screen before he comes out here and starts eating all the plants and running around everywhere. Baby, it's not time to play chase right now, okay? I'm not playing with you. Ow. Milo. Hey, you're interrupting my video. Get out of the garden. Get out of the garden. Out. No, no, no! All right, so back to gardening. So when the plants get bigger, I don't really tend to prune as much, mostly because I want all of this to be completely filled out. I want to make sure, you know, that I get nice big bushy plants that trellis all the way across. I do prune quite a bit on the parts that kind of like come into this little walkway, right? Because when I'm walking and everything on both sides of the trellis, or on both trellises, are kind of like in the middle of the pathway, I don't want to be ducking under things. So anything that kind of comes this way, I let it hang off maybe about 6 inches or so, but the rest of it kind of just gets a clean prune. So I try to make sure it's not too bushy, and I will throughout the season get rid of those suckers. But with the suckers, if you are getting rid of all of them, then your plant will ultimately produce less fruit, right? Because these suckers, as you can see here, these suckers have their own little flower buds on them. So if you get rid of all of them, you are getting rid of a lot of fruit, which is one reason that when they're growing out, when they're little, I do get rid of them on the, you know, on the baby plants. But as the plants grow, one of the ways that I do manage to get tons more tomatoes on my indeterminate varieties is just by leaving the suckers in place. Okay, so now you can tell, right, my tomato plants have been pruned off for the most part. Nothing is touching the floor. And as you can see, I have this trellis. Now this trellis, right, it goes in between these 2x4s. I plant out my tomatoes pretty close to the edge of the box. They still have a square foot each, right? So this is 4 square feet for these 4 tomato plants, but these ones get planted out much closer to the trellis. And I kind of start leaning them when they're little. I start leaning them underneath, and ultimately they do go right underneath the actual trellis part. So the tomatoes are now on the outside of the trellis, as you can see here, and then they will grow up and I will train them up the trellis. Now right now they're pretty much, you know, growing themselves up the trellis, but as they grow taller and taller, you will need to use some of these things. As you can see here, from last season I used like these little tomato ties, and I just continue propping them up and just making sure that they are actually attached to the trellis and that all of their limbs and branches are attached. Now you can use those tomato ties. The ones that you saw on my trellis are pretty much just these ones, and I cut them up into about three or four pieces each, just so I can get more out of them, but they work really well. Or you can use something like this, which is a Velcro that's meant for trellising tomatoes up. You know, just kind of use the Velcro like that, you know, to trellis against whatever pole you're using. Now I have used this in the past and I like using this because it is very sturdy. It is a little bit of a pain when it comes to de-trellising your tomatoes, right? So at the end of the season it's less convenient to get these off versus just like zip ties or whatever, the sandwich bag twisty ties or whatever you want to call these. I will link both of them below. Both of them work pretty well. And then at the end of the season, I just keep these ones, right? I remove my tomatoes and I just hook them back up here so that next season, whatever plant is growing in here is gonna use this trellis, of course, and I just trellis them with these. So I'm gonna come in here and I'm gonna start maybe trellising this one over here because it's not nearly as attached, and as this one grows, this is probably about the point where it's gonna start toppling over, and it's just gonna continue growing and it's not going to be as sturdy. So this is much easier not with one hand, but I'm going to come in here and just do a little zip tie thing, and you can tie it over a couple times, but basically just like that. I'm going to twist them and then they are attached to the trellis, so that's not going anywhere. It's going to just be supported. You know, as you get much longer leaves, much bigger, thicker branches, you're going to want to trellis a little bit tighter, and maybe wrap that over a couple times. And this one I'll just leave it like that because this branch is just kind of keeping it up straight, so I don't really need a tie on it right now. And then as these ones get bigger, I will find a good point in time to kind of like just sandwich them like this and push them through one of these upper holes in the fence, or in the trellis rather. They will kind of like poke their way out the same way that these ones did with this little gap here, but they'll just make their way kind of slowly, which will be fine because then we'll have, you know, the lower level of tomatoes, and then there'll be tomatoes on the inside of the trellis as well, and eventually they'll start climbing up the same way that the other ones did. Okay, so on to the Determinate tomatoes. You can still hear Milo crying in the background that he wants to come and play. So you are going to need a way to trellis these. They do not need quite as large of a trellis because of course they just, you know, they don't grow that big, but they are very, very thick and they will topple over because the weight of all of the larger tomatoes does tend to just wreak havoc on them. So I am going to do the Florida weave. If you've never heard of that technique, it is basically a way to trellis them, but not really on a trellis. So I'm going to use this, which is like just garden twine, and then I'm going to use my little, nobody can see it here, let me get a better picture. That is basically it. So these are T-posts. They are plastic T-posts, and they have these little hooks on them that you can just kind of, you know, hook stuff on. So they were maybe like $3 each or $2 each, something like that. I have already stuck them down in here about 6 inches, but at the end of each one of them there is like a metal stake that you just drive into the ground. It's pretty simple. You don't need any special tools. So I am going to basically take my garden twine. I am going to weave it, hence the name, the Florida weave. I'm going to weave it in and out, creating like a zigzag pattern all the way up. And then the tomatoes are going to weave themselves in between the string, essentially. But of course, before I do that, I'm going to come in here and pick off all of these lower branches so that you're not getting all infested with, you know, all of these pests or disease or whatever, because the ground does get wet, and as these tomato leaves get wet, it picks up all of the pest and disease and all of that. And plus it just provides for more airflow, you know, between the leaves and the branches of the plant. So you can see here's a little sucker actually growing here. This one is going to be pretty easy to take off. For the most part, if the leaves are not as thick, you can just, you know, pop them off with your nails. If not, then you will need that pair of scissors that I was using earlier. Oop. All right. I think I'll probably leave these ones like that for right now, and then as they grow, because these ones aren't as big actually, as they grow I will take off more. Now with determinate tomatoes, right, these are not my large vining trellising tomatoes, these are my determinate tomatoes. You want to prune off the suckers, all right, up until the very first flower cluster. So in here you can see I have my very first flower cluster, right? It's gonna start, these are little tomato buds. Now I am going to prune off all of the suckers up until that point. After that point, I'm not going to do any more pruning on this. As far as suckers go, I will just remove some of the bottom leaves that do tend to, you know, grow back from these same little nodules. But as far as suckers go, I am not going to prune off anything else above those little flowers. All right, so for the Florida weave, right, to trellis these type of tomatoes that only grow to about 2 or 4 feet, I'm going to take this. And just for the record, you could definitely use like a tomato cage or something like that. I just happen to not really love tomato cages because I don't want to reach my hand inside the tomato cage to have to grab the fruit. It just, in my opinion, it creates more of like a searching game for your fruit. And then, you know, sometimes there's critters and stuff, and I'm not like the biggest fan of having my hand like all up in whatever's living in there. So this way I just feel like it provides a lot more airflow between the plants. You know, there's no guessing to see if there's, you know, rotting fruit inside the tomato cage. So we're gonna go ahead with the Florida weave. I'm gonna take my string here, and you can use like cotton string or garden twine or whatever you have on hand. I'm going to take this and ultimately just make a little knot around this first nodule here. I don't know if you can see that, it's kind of like tiny, but this one here, you can see there's some from last season, which is kind of just, you know, breaking itself down. So that's fine, I'll just let that decompose. But I'm going to make a knot at this first level, and I'm going to string it all the way across. I'll give you a better look of what it actually looks like. It'll make more sense when it's completed. And you can definitely do this when the tomatoes are much smaller or before the tomatoes have been planted out. It just kind of got away from me this season. There's been a lot going on. So right now is as good a time as any. Once the tomatoes are in here like this, I'm gonna just go ahead and give them a head start and kind of like weave them in and out. And then just kind of tie this on the other side. So as I do this, I'm going to keep this attached, and I am going to just hook it around the little hooks that are on the sides of this here on the inside. And I'm just going to kind of sandwich my tomato plants in place like this. And then I'm going to come in here and twist it a little bit so that it holds in place. And you want to make sure that the actual poles that you're using here are pretty steady, that they're really not going to go anywhere, they're not going to topple over, because of course that would kind of defeat the purpose of a trellis. Alright, so as you can see, this is the Florida weave. You get all of these little, you know, strings here, and as the tomatoes grow, you will just continue weaving them in and out between these little strings here. You want to make sure that this isn't, you know, too tight, because then these things will definitely cave themselves in and end up like a little triangle here. But at the same time, you want to make sure that they're not like super loose either, you know, because that kind of defeats the purpose of the trellis. I do find though that as the tomatoes grow and there's more branches, you know, this gets a little bit tighter, so there's not as much give. Alright, and then all of this stuff here, all of the tomato leaves can go in compost. As long as there's no disease or pest on them, then they should be perfectly fine. Normally whatever I prune goes straight to the chickens, but do not feed your tomato plants to your chickens. They will not like it, and it's really not good for them anyway. Alright, so that pretty much wraps up our video on how to prune and trellis tomato plants, both indeterminate and determinate varieties. If you like this video, please like and subscribe for more urban homesteading, urban gardening content, more chicken videos, all of that. Thanks so much for watching, and I will see you in the next one.